Welcome to Motivated to Lead podcast, helping you become a better leader. I'm your host, Mark Klingstein. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for our podcast this week. My name is Mark Klingstein with SEMA Partners. Each week, we interview leaders and they share lessons learned from their careers. Our goal is to help you become a better leader. This week, we're happy to have with us James Reinstein. He is a CEO of Saranas, a medical technology company. He has been a CEO for a number of companies and served on boards. He has some great thoughts and insights he's going to share with us today. Looking forward to our conversation with James. James, it's great to have you on our podcast and looking forward to our conversation.
Me as well. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. I guess first off, can you give us just a little bit of an overview of your career and a little bit of your story?
Sure. Happy to do it, Mark. So started out with Procter Gamble, kind of the sales school coming out of University of Georgia, and was promoted a couple of times. And that basically was the hunting ground for Boston Scientific back in the early 90s. They went after folks that had come out of the sales school of Procter Gamble, Black & Decker, Gallo Wines. And also had been promoted. I guess they figure if you're good enough to be promoted at P&G, you're good enough for Boston Scientific. So I went to what was called Meditech at the time. It was ultimately their vascular division. Carried the sales bag, moved into a marketing role, which was more of a BD role, and got Boston Scientific into the interventional oncology space through acquisitions and strategic alliances. And I had always expressed an interest to do an expatriate assignment. My father-in-law, who's great friend of mine, but also my wife's father, he was an expat with Kodak back when Kodak was a real company. And just because of that experience and visiting him, I'd always expressed an interest to be a C. To live overseas. And I also thought that's a career rounder, something I learned also from my father-in-law's. If you ever really want to run a company and a global company, you need to have that international experience. So the first one was real easy to sell to my wife. It was Paris. Boston Scientific was opening up a Parisian headquarters. And so I went there in a kind of a marketing role. It turned into a very different role because Boston acquired about 15 companies in the 5 years I was there. I integrated about half of them into the various different divisions. The last integration I did was actually the neurovascular division. Target Therapeutics was acquired. Ended up running that division, the European arm of it at least, which was about 70% of the revenue at the time. And did that as my last role there. Came back into a marketing role in Boston Scientific in the headquarters. Was in a quarterly business review meeting with the VP of Latin America. He was, bemoaning the woes he was dealing with in Mexico. And I suggested, well, have you tried this or you thought about that? And finally, he was exacerbated with this young chipper in the corner and said, why don't you do that? And I literally shrugged my shoulders at the head of international. He shrugged back, and 2 weeks later, my wife and I were house hunting in Mexico City.
Cool.
Even though she was 7 months pregnant at the time.
Wow.
So a little bit more difficult sale than Paris, but nonetheless, we were there. It was a great 5 years that we were there, and the success that we achieved was the reason why I was then asked several times. I turned it down once or twice, but to go to Korea. And I was head of a region of China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea, called it the Greater China region. And I was the VP there for 3 years, and then left Boston Scientific, left the region, and ended up in Houston, Texas, with a company called Cyberonics, so a neurostim company. Dan Moore had become the CEO just recently, recruited me in as a chief commercial officer. And, we really had, it's called a turnaround, but it was really a reclamation. The company had significant issues, cash being one of them. But we basically came in, did, I think what I had a reputation for doing is running into the burning house and saving bodies. And we essentially took that business from about $300 million in market cap up over $2 billion by the time I left. Well, after I left, that became LivaNova, which is now a multi-billion-dollar market cap company. The reason I left is the board had done an internal survey of candidates to become the CEO to replace Dan. And they said, yeah, Reinstein, you're the guy, you're going to replace him, but we're going to try to sign him for 4 more years, which they did, which was great for the company, great for Dan, great for everybody except James, I guess. And I said to the board, look, you think I'm ready to run one. I want to run one. So I went out, I resigned with an end date and went out, started looking for a role. And it was my first CEO job, which was to run Aptus Endosystems. And it was had just gotten FDA approval, was funded by some good names in the venture space, Longitude Capital, Synergy came in, and USVP as well, and ran that. It was commercial stage, and that's really what the transition was. Replaced a CEO who Jeff Elkins, who stayed in the company, and that's always a tricky maneuver, but we succeeded. 3 years later, he was still there, and we sold it to Medtronic for about 10 times revenue. And then I went into a new co for GE Ventures, GE Healthcare, called Drawbridge Health. Ran that for about a year or so, and then left to go run Cutera, which is in the aesthetics laser space, publicly traded company. So that was very interesting. And laid out the plans. Again, it was a bit of a turnaround there as well. Got it in place, and then left there early 2019, and then I've been doing consulting ever since. Multiple projects with different companies, primarily helping them raise money. That seems to be the theme with most companies. So that's the story, and that's what I'm doing now in Houston, helping a company raise money.
Okay. So I like to ask this question of every guest. If you were knowing what you know now, if you were able to go back and talk to a 22-year-old James, what advice would you give him?
Well, I got some great advice early on. As I mentioned, my father-in-law and a few others. And it's the advice I actually took, and it was, take the job that nobody else will take. I don't know how many people they asked to go to Mexico. Believe it or not, many people in Boston Scientific in the mid-90s had no interest to going over, expat assignments, going to Europe even at the time. So again, there was, I'm sure other people asked. I was the one that always raised my hand for that sort of thing. Maybe the advice I didn't take, it could have been with regards to, there certainly are paths that you can always take. I always wonder, had I stayed at Cyberonics, quite frankly, what that would have looked like. Remained there, then stayed on through the merger with Soren Group. But I guess at 22 years old, I wasn't listening to anybody anyway, so
Right.
It wouldn't have been me to listen to me either.
So you've built a number of leadership teams over your career. You've also served on boards. You've seen leadership teams be built. Any advice that you would give somebody that maybe is in their first leadership position and they're looking to put together their team? What advice would you give them?
So I can tell you in my career and in a number of instances, and I don't do this purposefully, but I tend to hire the person that I think is probably about half ready for the job. Mm-hmm. A little bit of philosophy on that is that basically if somebody has been there, done that, and done it maybe even several times, yeah, they've got the pedigree and the experience, but they may be bored with it, or they may have reached their Peter principle. And so I always look for the person who really wants to prove themselves, has never done it before, and hopefully with some influence that I can provide, can give the guidance that can get them to the success that we all want them to achieve.
So what mistakes do you see people doing when they're hiring people, and just some of your thoughts around that and things to avoid?
Well, I mean, I can speak to my own mistakes. Hiring is tricky. It's certainly, I think there's definitely an art to it. I can tell you, the Aptus example, my thinking was, I would hire a lot of former colleagues of mine from Boston Scientific, the vascular reps that had sold for Boston or Medtronic or others. And what I learned pretty quickly is what we were doing at Aptus was developing a whole new market. and what the reps at that point in time, maybe we were early on developing a market in the early 90s when I was carrying a bag, but by 2012, a lot of the selling was more around, I'll call it the bureaucracy of hospital management and what have you, versus real market development. So I think, it took us a while, but defining the real criteria and the real scope of who are the physicians we're targeting, and then who's best to serve that targeted physician. And, we got well out of the vascular space. We got beyond the, even the traditional companies, even sometimes med tech companies, and hired folks that, we thought were just going to be out there to create something new. And the other, and so what I guess my initial thought on answering that question was basically you can't always go to the person you know. Mm-hmm. It may be easier initially, but they may not be the right person longer term, because it may be easier initially because you can have that 5-minute conversation, which will take you 20 minutes with somebody you don't know as well. But longer term, they just may not be the right person for the role, and you can get a little blinded in hiring that way.
Mm. So as we're in a unique time in our history, there's a lot of leaders that I've been talking to have said that, it's definitely unprecedented as far as to have a lot of your team all of a sudden be virtual, where you used to have them in an office. What have you seen that's been working? And you've got a team that you're working with currently. What's been working for you guys as far as you're managing during this time?
Well, I can tell you as a little bit what we were alluding to before we started, is a great deal of tolerance to the distractions that are going to occur in the environment that the person is working in now. Yep. It's no longer as a controlled environment. So when the dog barks or the doorbell rings and they got to get up and whatever, you really just need to allow for that. And it's also made accessibility, people, far more accessible, which is, I think, good. What you do miss out on, though, is kind of that informal, everything's kind of arranged and set up, versus having informal chats as you're walking down the hall to the cafeteria or what have you. But what I've found, something that we've done with the team I'm working with now is essentially we'll have we use Teams, and we'll have it going, and we'll even just be doing our own work, but I call it the Big Brother session. It's like, we're all going to talk to each other, but as you're working, and if you just want to chime in and say something, or if you don't, just hit your turn your sound off or your mute, what have you. But let's just kind of be present together while we're doing our own work. I'd say it's been a mixed bag on that, as far as initially a little bit awkward, but I think we're continuing with it because people appreciate at least that engagement opportunity.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard that from a couple of people, and they've said that it is strange the first time you do it, but you at least feel like you're a part of something more than just sitting by yourself all day long and kind of doing it on your own.
The fact that a lot of it's bench or workstations all together. Yep. People really got used to it. The folks with ADD never got used to it.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of how you're wired and what works for you. And for some people, it's great. Others, it's a shiny object and they're distracted. Yeah. So you've done startups. You've been a part of large organizations. Talk a little bit about kind of moving from an organization that's larger to a startup role. What were some things that you had to adjust to and adapt? And what would you say somebody that maybe is thinking about doing a startup or they're leading a startup?
I would say, and I do get this question pretty often, and mainly because I made the leap. I kind of teared down from a Boston Scientific, 30,000 employees, to a Cyberonics of it was about 700 when I got there, and about 400 a year later. But then we got it back to 700. And then to a startup, which I think Aptus was about 20 or so people when I joined, over 100 when I left. the GE thing, I was employee number one. I guess I relayed this during the interviewing process when I was meeting with the partners at Longitude and USVP. Is like, well, how are you going to make this transition from a Cyberonics of hundreds of people? You did it, from Boston Scientific. And I said, well, when you look at when I was in Boston Scientific, Mexico, I was the general manager of a fairly autonomously run organization. And once a quarter, I either went to Boston or my boss and his team came to Mexico City and did a quarterly business review, which for me was akin to running a board meeting. And so I said, I've kind of been acting like a CEO. I ran a P&L and I hired people, fired people, made a lot of my own decisions. The big ones went to the board. So what I've said to people, I said, when you're thinking about the CEO role or this transition into, just try to figure out how, even in that huge organization, how your world was small. I mean, you probably worked within a division or a microcosm of that organization that really just kind of made it small. Now, maybe bigger decisions took longer than are going to happen in a smaller company. And I do remember at Cyberonics, I was in a meeting my first week, and they presented something about a pricing policy that was in place. And in so many words, I said, "God, that's terrible. We should change it, and it should look like this." It was done the next day, which scared me in the sense that, wow, we really move fast, and A, we move fast, but B, I don't know, is that really? I mean, should we have thought about that a little bit more?
Sure.
So,
Yeah. Most of the CEOs I talk to that don't realize the amount of time in a startup that they're spending fundraising, and that their title is also not only CEO but their chief fundraising officer. Talk a little bit about that, as you've gone out and you've raised money and worked with VCs as well as other groups, angel investors, I'm sure. Talk a little bit about that experience.
Well, I mean, it's you got. It kind of depends on who you're raising money for, meaning which entity is you raising money for, and therefore you get stage and type of product and all sorts of elements. I mean, I have a pool, a list of hundreds, if not approaching 1,000 different investors across the spectrum. When you include high net worth individuals that are investing, it's probably well into the thousands. And so it's really important for me that when I go to an investor that I've thought through that it's appropriate for that investor. Knowing what I know about the investor, that I think they've come to know I'm not going to waste their time with something because I don't want to waste my own time. And CEOs, you learn pretty quickly that as soon as you hear about a fund that's no longer investing, or they're at the end of the fund and waiting to raise their next one, it's just let's not waste any time with that. Let's just move on. And so the advice I'd give is really understand your value thesis and make sure it matches with their investment thesis before you spend a lot of time chasing. And the other is, shockingly enough, or maybe not, it's amazing how you send out notes and try to engage. I would say at least a third does never even reply. So get used to that. But then what I have found is, if there's generally a partnership of 3, 4, 5, or 30. Sometimes maybe try a new partner if you really know that this should be a fit for that fund. And then in the current environment, what I found is these investors are pretty accessible, which is really good because you can get meetings. What's really bad is their deal flow has increased, to order of magnitude, so that, even now I'll have an investor that says, yeah, I'm interested. Can we do a Zoom next month? 4 weeks from now or something like that, which is because they just say we're flat out right now. So it's kind of that's the double-edged sword of current environment.
Sure. Yeah. It's, and I think part of the whole people are probably more accessible just because they're not traveling and some of the other things that's taking up time. But you're right. It seems like that people's calendars are getting maxed out. Any books that you recommend to leaders as you continue to grow and develop? Anything that is kind of on your must-read list?
Thank you for the question prior, so it gave me time to think about it. One just jumped out at me. I read the Bible, and it's an important part of my life. The other book I've read multiple times. It's a 6-font, 3,000-page book called Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. For me, that's just all about personal will and accountability, and there's not to be political, but there's people always run to the politics of that book. But for me, it's more about what you are personally. And then since you asked for 3, I'm going to give you a category for the third, and that's I'd say it all started for me was the emotional intelligence book by Gladstone, but kind of in that category, one I'm reading now is called Nonviolent Communication. Which is a strange title. However, it really is more of a psychology book about how to communicate based on the other person's needs. And so that's where I sort of categorize that book and a few others, the emotional intelligence book of kind of shaping my leadership style around figuring out what's right for the person. And I can tell you I have this philosophy about, what I look for in a boss. And it's, 1, am I going to learn from him? 2, can I trust him or her? And 3, can they move my career, elevate my career? But, it's that trust. If you don't have the trust, then you end up with the middle finger. And that becomes really the most important element for me is just working people. Obviously I'd like to but if I don't respect and trust, then it doesn't matter how much I like them.
Yeah, that's good. So what, outside of work, what do you do to recharge?
I have 3 kids off to college. Most of them, I got one, he's a senior at Georgetown. He's graduating with a job, thankfully. He's going to go work for Piper in investment banking. A daughter who just started as a freshman. She's a swimmer at University of Georgia. So she was a recruited athlete there. Obviously an odd time to be starting college, but she's there. She's in the pool. She's, doing what she loves most. And then a senior in high school who's going to go off to college, we hope, next year. Obviously very busy with that and kind of the commuting I'm doing between California and Texas now. For fun, I love golf. Every chance I get, try to get my wife into it as well. And, we still like to and will do travel. We had a nice time in the mountains and hiking and even in California when we're there. It's, the beauty of California is, when it's not, full of smoke, you can go up to the mountains within 5 minutes and have a nice hike, and that's a great fun for me. Or I can just hop on my bike and be flying around the Bay Area on my bicycle. I was doing that every day during the lockdown. So
yeah, no, we're hoping. Have been talking to quite a few people out in the Bay Area. They're looking for some clean air in the near future. So hopefully that gets some relief. So what parting advice would you give someone as if they're starting their leadership role, maybe for the first time or earlier in their career?
Well, it's the advice that I got and I took, which was take the job that nobody else wants. In fact, that move to Seoul, Korea was one I had turned down twice. Finally, the third time it was, I don't know if I didn't have a choice, you always have a choice, but the experience there, working with all the different, the business-wise, professionally was fantastic, but it was also an age where my kids were old enough to travel. They went to 8 different countries throughout Asia, which would have never, Cambodia, Vietnam, would have never been on our list of places to visit. So that's coincides with the other advice I get. We do all this travel throughout our careers. Try to take an extra day and visit the city you're going to, not just the hospital and the office or just the airport. I used to joke with my mom because she'd say, "Oh, where are you now?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm in Milan." She goes, "Oh, that's so exciting." I said, "Well, no, I mean, it's an airport, a hotel, and a hospital. I mean, that's
Right.
just like Cleveland."
Yeah, right.
But you can take advantage of that as also get out. I highly recommend, and I give anytime I can get a phone call, which I do fairly regularly, from somebody considering an expatriate assignment. Definitely, that's a career elevator as well, in my opinion.
Well, thanks, James. This has been, I've enjoyed our conversation and wish you continued success as you're helping these companies with their strategy and their growth, and definitely appreciate your thoughts today.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the invitation, and always great to see you.
Thank you for listening to the Motivated to Lead podcast. Please subscribe on iTunes. You can also see a video version of this interview at motivatedtolead.com. This podcast is brought to you by SEMA Partners, helping you find your next great leader.